There are years in history that are stained with blood. There are years remembered for war, for revolution, for the fall of empires. But there is only one year that is remembered for the death of the light itself. Ask a historian what the worst year in human history was, and they will not tell you 1918 or 1945 or 1347. They will tell you, without hesitation, that it was the year of our Lord, 536. It was the year the sun became a phantom. It was the year the seasons shattered, jumbled together in a chaotic ruin of frost and rot. It was the year the sky turned into a shroud, a thick, suffocating veil of corpse-grey dust that stretched from the Pillars of Hercules to the rice paddies of China. This was a global cataclysm, a literal apocalypse that struck humanity at the height of its pride. In China, the stars vanished, and yellow dust rained down like snow, choking the life out of the earth. In Scandinavia, the great winter known as Fimbulwinter began, a freeze so deep it would birth the legend of Ragnarok, the end of all things. It was the year the shadow swallowed the legendary King Arthur at the Battle of Camlan, forever linking the death of the once and future king to the death of the sun itself. It was the moment that birthed a terrified, apocalyptic Christianity, a theology of the end times that still haunts our spiritual consciousness today. And following the darkness came the hunger, and following the hunger came the madness, and following the madness came the plague. This is not a story of ancient myth. This is the story of the moment humanity looked up at the heavens and saw nothing but the abyss staring back. This is the story of 536 AD, the year the sun died, and the long, dark nightmare that followed. The horror did not begin with a scream, but with a silence. It began in the early months of 536, when the sky underwent a terrifying transformation. Across the Mediterranean world, people woke to a morning that never truly broke. The sun rose, but it was not the golden, life-giving orb they had worshipped for millennia. It was a bluish, feeble disk, shorn of its rays, casting no shadows even at high noon. The Roman statesman Cassiodorus, writing from the Ostrogothic court in Italy, described the terror of looking up at a sky that had become blended with alien elements, stretched like a hide across the heavens. He wrote of a blue-coloured sun and a moon that, even when full, was empty of splendour. Imagine the visceral dread of a population that had no concept of volcanic aerosols or stratospheric dust veils. To them, this was not weather. This was theology. This was God turning his face away from his creation. The air grew thick and heavy, filled with a dry, dense fog that no wind could scatter. It hung over the cities of Rome and Athens, over the deserts of Egypt, and the forests of Gaul, a suffocating blanket that dimmed the world to a perpetual twilight. Men walked through the streets like ghosts, their faces pale in the wash of the dying light. Colours were drained from the world, the vibrant reds of imperial robes, the lush greens of the olive groves, the sparkling azure of the sea. All were reduced to a flat, monochromatic grey. It was as if the world was rotting while it was still alive, losing its vitality, its saturation, its very essence. But the darkness was only the first of the horrors. With the dimming of the sun came the cold. It was a cold that defied the calendar, a supernatural chill that settled into the bones of the earth. In the summer of 536, snow fell in Mesopotamia. In China, in the height of August, frost killed the crops in the fields, turning the rice black and brittle. The seasons, the reliable clockwork of the natural world, had broken. Cassiodorus wrote of a winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. The apples hardened on the branches, refusing to ripen. The grapes turned sour and withered on the vine, producing a wine that the chroniclers described as tasting like urine. The natural order had been suspended. The earth, deprived of the sun's warmth, began to die. But what had actually happened? For centuries, historians and scientists were baffled. Was it a comet? A meteor impact? The anger of God? It wasn't until modern glaciologists drilled deep into the ice of the Swiss Alps and Greenland that the culprit was found frozen in time. Buried 72 meters deep in the ice, precisely in the layer corresponding to 536 AD, they found volcanic glass. Somewhere in the northern hemisphere, likely Iceland, or perhaps a cataclysmic eruption in North America, the earth had torn itself open. A massive volcano erupted with such violence that it didn't just spew ash. It injected millions of tons of sulfate aerosols directly into the stratosphere. This was not a local disaster. It was a global veil. These aerosols formed a perfect, reflective mirror in the upper atmosphere. They didn't just block the sun, they reflected its heat back into space. It was a volcanic winter that happened almost instantaneously. One day, it was summer. The next, a curtain of sulfur was drawn across the world, dropping global temperatures by up to 2.5 degrees Celsius in a matter of weeks. The engine of the climate was choked by the Earth's own breath. Humanity was not being punished by the heavens. We were being suffocated by the ground beneath our feet. Fear began to curdle into hysteria. In the churches and temples, the priests offered desperate prayers, but the sky remained impassive, a slate of grey iron. People began to see omens in the shadows. They saw faces in the fog, demons riding the strange, muted winds. The psychological toll of living in a world without sunlight cannot be overstated. The circadian rhythms of man and beast were shattered. Birds stopped singing, confused by the endless twilight. Livestock grew skittish and refused to eat. Humans, deprived of vitamin D and crushed by the oppressive gloom, sank into a collective depression, a lethargy of the soul that mirrored the dimming of the world. They were living in a tomb, sealed in with their own mounting terror. And as the months dragged on, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months of twilight, the stockpiles of grain began to run low. The cold had killed the harvest. The darkness had killed the hope. And now, the hunger was coming to finish what the shadows had started. When the crops failed, the civilization that stood upon them crumbled. The agricultural collapse of 536 and the following years was total and devastating. In the north of China, the yellow dust that rained from the sky, volcanic ash carried on the jet stream, coated the fields in a toxic layer. The chronicles record that stars were lost from view for 3 months, and that in some provinces, 80% of the people died. This was not a statistic. This was a landscape of skeletons, families crazed with hunger, wandering the frozen roads, eating grass, eating leather, eating the dead. The social contract, the thin veneer of order that keeps humanity from savagery, evaporated along with the food supply. In the Mediterranean, the situation was no less apocalyptic. The Roman world was built on grain, the annona, the massive shipments of wheat from Egypt and North Africa that fed the teeming populations of Constantinople and Rome. But the ships stopped coming, or when they did arrive, they carried only rumours of failure. The Nile, usually the lifeblood of the empire, behaved erratically. The drought in East Africa, triggered by the disruption of the monsoon rains, meant the river did not flood. The fertile black earth turned to dust. The breadbaskets of the empire were empty. In the countryside of Italy, the famine took on a grotesque, nightmarish quality. Procopius, travelling with the Byzantine general Belisarius, witnessed scenes that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He described emaciated peasants whose skin had turned black, like the burned brands of a fire. He wrote of women who became like wild beasts, hunting for food with a feral intensity. In one particularly horrific account, he tells of 2 women in a remote farmhouse who survived by cannibalizing the travelers who sought shelter with them. They had eaten 17 men before they were discovered. This was the reality of the famine. It stripped away the humanity of its victims, reducing men to meat and survivors to monsters. The famine was not just a lack of food, it was a physical assault on the body. The starving body consumes itself. Muscles waste away, the belly distends, the eyes sink deep into the skull, giving the face a skull-like appearance. In the dim blue light of the year 536, the villages of Europe became populated by walking corpses. They huddled in their unheated hovels, too weak to bury their dead. The stench of decomposition mingled with the dry, dusty fog. There were no scavengers to pick the bones clean, for the dogs and the rats had starved too, or had been eaten by the desperate. The silence of the countryside was absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through empty barns and the weeping of those who still had the strength to cry. This misery was not confined to the old world. Across the ocean, in the Andes Mountains of Peru, the Moche civilization was facing its own apocalypse. Ice cores from the Quelcaya Glacier show that this period marked the beginning of a 30-year drought. The Moche, masters of irrigation and desert agriculture, watched their canals dry up and their corn wither. In a desperate attempt to appease their angry gods, they ramped up their rituals of human sacrifice. Archaeologists have found the remains of hundreds of young men, their throats slit, their bodies thrown into the mud during rare, catastrophic torrential rains that interspersed the drought, the chaotic weather of El Niño on steroids. They were bleeding their youth into the dust, begging for a return to normalcy that would not come. The global climate system had convulsed, and everywhere humanity was paying the price in blood. If the darkness was the omen, and the famine was the torture, then the plague was the executioner. It arrived in 541 AD, 5 years after the sun first dimmed, striking a population that was already malnourished, terrified, and weak. It entered the Mediterranean through the port of Pelusium in Egypt, carried in the bellies of fleas, riding on the backs of black rats that scurried up the mooring ropes of grain ships. It was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later be known as the Black Death. But to the people of the 6th century, it had no name. It was simply the mortality. Procopius, trapped in the besieged city of Constantinople as the plague hit, provides a description that reads like a descent into hell. He noted that the disease did not follow the rules of normal sickness. It struck without warning. A healthy man would be standing in the market, or a woman weaving at her loom, and suddenly they would feel a slight fever. Within days, the horror would manifest. Buboes, hard, painful swellings, would erupt in the groin, the armpits, behind the ears. They grew to the size of eggs, then apples, turning black and gangrenous as the tissue died. The pain was excruciating, sending victims into a delirium of screaming agony. But the physical horror was matched by the psychological terror. Procopius records a chilling detail that suggests a mass psychosis, or perhaps a biological effect of the high fever on the brain. He wrote that many victims, before the fever even took them, saw demons in human shape. These spectral figures would approach them, striking them or whispering their names. Those who saw the demons knew they were marked for death. Others heard voices calling them from empty rooms, or saw phantom ships of black wood sailing through the sky, crewed by the headless dead. The boundary between the nightmare of the plague and the nightmare of reality had dissolved. In Constantinople, the death toll rose with terrifying speed. 5,000 a day, then 10,000 a day. The bureaucracy of the great empire, usually so efficient, collapsed under the weight of the corpses. There were no longer enough living to bury the dead. The graveyards overflowed. Bodies were tossed into the sea, washing back up on the shore in bloated heaps. They were stuffed into the towers of the city walls, layer upon layer of rotting flesh, until the vile decomposition fluid began to leak through the stones and trickle down into the streets. The stench of the city was so thick it could be tasted. It was the smell of the end of the world. The Emperor Justinian himself fell ill, a bubo swelling in his groin. He survived, but the empire he ruled was effectively dead. The plague hollowed out the cities, leaving whole neighborhoods silent. It devastated the army, leaving the frontiers undefended. It ravaged the countryside, leaving crops rotting in the fields because there was no one left to harvest them. The rats, fat on the flesh of the unburied, multiplied in the ruins. This was biological horror on a scale the world had never seen. It was a pestilence that did not discriminate. It took the senator and the slave, the priest and the prostitute. It was a great levelling scythe, sweeping across a world that had already been beaten to its knees by the dark sun. And in the minds of the survivors, there was no doubt. This was the punishment of God. The apocalypse was not a prophecy, it was a current event. While the south rotted in the heat of fever, the north was freezing in a prison of ice. In Scandinavia, the effects of the 536 cooling event were catastrophic. This was a society living on the edge of the habitable world, where a drop of even a few degrees meant the difference between survival and extinction. When the sun failed, the summer simply did not come. The snows of winter lingered on the ground through June and July. The cattle, the wealth of the chieftains, died in their stalls, their ribs jutting out like the rafters of a ruined house. The crops lay buried under the frost. This climatic trauma was so severe that it seared itself into the mythology of the Germanic peoples. This is the origin of the Fimbulwinter, the great winter of Norse legend that precedes Ragnarok. The Eddas describe it. Snow driving from all quarters, a great frost and keen winds. The sun imparts no gladness. 3 winters shall pass together, with no summer in between. This was not a metaphor. This was a historical record of the year 536 and the decade of cold that followed. The myth speaks of brothers killing brothers for food, of the bonds of kinship shattering, a mirror of the societal collapse revealed by archaeology. Across Sweden and Norway, archaeologists have found hundreds of settlements that were abandoned in the middle of the 6th century. Farms that had been occupied for generations were suddenly left empty, the hearths cold, the tools left where they lay. In some regions, 75% of the population disappeared. They didn't just move, they died. The forests reclaimed the fields, growing over the burial mounds of a people who starved in the dark. In their desperation, the people of the north turned to their gods with a frantic, bloody zeal. We see this in the explosion of gold bracteates, thin, stamped amulets of gold that appear in hoards from this specific period. They feature the image of Odin, the god of magic and death, often healing a horse or breathing life into a victim. These were not jewelry. They were desperate prayers cast in precious metal, buried in the earth, to beg the gods to bring back the sun. But the gold was not enough. Evidence from bog bodies and ritual sites suggests a darker turn. As the Fimbulwinter dragged on, the sacrifices became more personal. Animals were not enough. Humans, children, warriors, perhaps even kings, were cast into the peat bogs, their throats cut, their bodies pinned down with stakes. They were offerings to a sun that refused to shine, blood prices paid in a vain attempt to restart the engine of the world. The horror of the north was a quiet, frozen horror. The silence of a snow-covered house where a family sits frozen around a fire that went out weeks ago, waiting for a dawn that never came. The combined weight of the darkness, the famine, and the plague shattered the political and social order of the ancient world. This was the tipping point, the moment when the classical world finally, truly died, and the Middle Ages began in the mud and the dark. In Italy, the kingdom of the Ostrogoths, which had maintained a semblance of Roman civilization, crumbled. The climatic chaos weakened their agricultural base, making them vulnerable to the invading Byzantine armies of Belisarius. But the liberators brought the plague with them, turning the Italian peninsula into a wasteland of war and disease. Rome, the eternal city, was besieged, starved, and depopulated. Its aqueducts were cut, its bathhouses went cold, its great forums fell silent. The city that once held 1 million people was reduced to a village of scavengers living among colossal ruins, herding goats in the Forum Romanum. In Britain, the post-Roman order collapsed into the Dark Ages in the truest sense. The Annales Cambriae record a great mortality in 537, the same year as the legendary Battle of Camlan, where King Arthur is said to have fallen. It is fitting that the death of the legendary king, the symbol of order and light, is linked to the year the sun died. The archaeological record shows a cessation of trade, a shrinking of settlements, a reversion to subsistence survival. The light of literacy flickered and went out. The psychological trauma of this era birthed a new, darker form of Christianity. This was no longer the triumphant religion of Constantine. It was a religion of the end times. The art of the period changed. The faces in the icons became gaunt, the eyes wide and staring, as if witnessing a horror. The focus shifted from salvation to judgment. The liturgy became obsessed with the apocalypse. Why wouldn't it? The prophecies of the Book of Revelation were playing out in real time. The sun had turned black, the moon had turned to blood, the stars had fallen or were hidden. Pestilence stalked the land. To the men and women of the 6th century, the question was not if the world was ending, but when the final trumpet would sound. They lived in a state of perpetual, existential dread. Every shadow held a demon, every cough was a death sentence, every stranger was a potential carrier of the pestilence. The social trust that allows a civilization to function, the trust that the money is good, that the law will protect you, that your neighbour won't eat you, was obliterated. It was a Hobbesian nightmare of the war of all against all, fought in the twilight of a dying sun. The empires did not just fall, they dissolved into a chaotic slurry of survivalism, superstition, and violence. We are the descendants of the survivors. Look around you, look at your hands, look at the people on the street. Every single human being alive today is descended from the few, the lucky, the resilient who managed to endure the hell of 536 AD. We are the children of the people who didn't starve when the crops failed, who didn't freeze when the Fimbulwinter came, who didn't rot when the buboes swelled. Our genetic memory is scarred by this event. It is in our myths of the end of the world. It is in our instinctive fear of the dark. It is in our obsession with the sun. The year 536 serves as a terrifying memento mori for our modern civilization. We like to think we are masters of our planet. We have split the atom, we have mapped the genome, we have touched the stars. But we are still, fundamentally, creatures of the sun. If the sky were to turn black tomorrow, if a supervolcano in Yellowstone or an asteroid impact were to replicate the dust veil of 536, our globalized, just-in-time world would crumble just as fast as the Romans and the Moche. Our supermarkets would be empty in 3 days. Our power grids would fail. Our order would dissolve. The story of the year the sun died is not just a history lesson. It is a ghost story. It is a reminder that the systems we rely on, the climate, the agriculture, the biology of our own bodies, are fragile. We are walking on a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark ocean, and 1,500 years ago the ice broke, the sun died, and humanity looked into the face of extinction and screamed. The sun eventually returned. The light came back. But the world had changed forever. The golden age was gone, buried under the ash and the bones. And in the long shadow of that year, we are still, in some ways, afraid of the dark.